Racist man demands black family leave first class. Pilot turns the plane around just for him. Have you ever witnessed the moment when privilege collides with justice at 30,000 feet? First class is supposed to be a sanctuary in the sky, a quiet bubble of luxury earned through success and hard work. It's a space where the elite retreat into plush leather seats, sip champagne, and momentarily escape the cramped confines of economy. But what happens when someone decides that not everyone deserves that sanctuary? When someone believes the color of your skin disqualifies you from the comfort you've rightfully purchased? Today, we witness such a collision, an entitled man's demand that a black family be removed from first class, and the extraordinary decision of one pilot who chose dignity over discrimination. This isn't just a story about an airplane turning around. It's about the moment when hate forced a U-turn, when prejudice met its match in principle, and when justice was served at cruising altitude. The choices made in the pressurized cabin of Flight 247 would ripple far beyond its metal walls, changing careers, corporations, and lives forever. It would prove that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred isn't revenge or rage. It's simply enforcing consequences. Before we take off with this remarkable true story, I want you to imagine yourself in that cabin. What would you do if you witnessed blatant discrimination? Would you speak up? Would you stay silent? Or would you, like Captain James Sullivan, be willing to turn everything around to stand for what's right? Buckle up. This is no ordinary flight. Is the plane going to go upside down? Dad. 6-year-old Noah Williams whispered the question as he clutched a small, brightly colored model airplane, a gift from a grateful patient's family, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and anxiety fixed on his father's face. Dr. Marcus Williams smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone whose hands regularly navigated the labyrinth of children's neural tissue, giving them second chances at life. Nobody. Commercial planes like this one keep all the passengers right side up. I promise. Marcus adjusted his necktie as he settled deeper into Seat 2C of American Airlines Flight 247 from New York's JFK to London Heathrow. The leather seat enveloped him with that particular new car scent that signaled luxury. He glanced at his son in the adjacent Seat 2B, making sure Noah's seatbelt was properly fastened. Across the aisle in seats 2D and 2A, his wife Olivia and their 9-year-old daughter Zoe engaged in their own pre-flight ritual. Olivia, whose landscape architectural designs had transformed public spaces across 3 major cities, pointed out the window at the ground crew's choreographed movements. Her natural curls were pulled back in an elegant twist, her caramel skin glowing even under the harsh cabin lights. "See how they're using those light wands to direct the plane?" she explained. "It's like conducting an orchestra, but with a 200-ton instrument." Zoe nodded seriously, already an avid reader like her mother. She had arranged a small collection of books on the spacious console beside her seat. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she decided which to begin first. Her fingers hovered between a historical novel about London and a book about the British royal family. The Williams family had meticulously planned this 2-week European vacation for months. It was a celebration of Marcus successfully launching a pediatric neurosurgical center that specialized in treating children from underserved communities. First class wasn't an indulgence. It was a strategic choice to ensure the family arrived, rested, and ready to explore the museums, parks, and historical sites of London. Marcus absently touched his watch, a sleek titanium Montblanc smartwatch with a midnight blue face that caught the cabin lights. Few people knew it contained a sophisticated recording app, something he'd started using after a hospital board meeting where his concerns about diversity in clinical trials had mysteriously vanished from the official minutes. Trust but verify had become his quiet mantra, the hard-won wisdom of navigating predominantly white spaces his entire career. As flight attendants moved through the cabin with pre-departure beverages, Marcus caught Olivia's eye across the aisle. Her smile warm, knowing Private was the same one that had captivated him during their first meeting 15 years earlier at a charity fundraiser. It conveyed a universe of shared understanding, pride, and affection. "Champagne, sir." A flight attendant offered Marcus a flute of golden liquid, tiny bubbles spiraling upward in a hypnotic dance. "Thank you," he replied, accepting the glass with a nod. For the Williams family, this moment in first class represented something deeper than luxury. It was the culmination of years of dedication, education, and persistence. Marcus had grown up in a small apartment in Baltimore, the son of a postal worker and a high school English teacher. His journey to becoming one of the country's leading pediatric neurosurgeons had been marked by scholarship student loans, 36-hour shifts, and an unrelenting commitment to excellence. Olivia's path had been similarly challenging. The daughter of Jamaican immigrants, she had worked her way through architecture school, often taking on 3 jobs simultaneously. Her award-winning landscape designs were now featured in architecture textbooks. Their success wasn't accidental, it was earned, and while they never took it for granted, they also never apologized for it. The first-class tickets bought with Marcus's frequent flyer miles meticulously accumulated through medical conferences and speaking engagements were a symbol of their journey. Noah's small airplane made gentle arcs in the air. The boys' quiet whoosh sounds barely audible above the cabin's ambient noise, the soft hum of the ventilation system, the occasional clink of glassware, the muted conversations of other passengers preparing for the transatlantic crossing. Zoe had selected her first book, the historical novel about London, and was already immersed in its pages, her finger tracing the words as she absorbed details about the Great Fire of 1666. The scene was one of tranquility and contentment, a perfect start to their long-anticipated family adventure. What they didn't yet realize was that their presence in first class had already become a source of intense irritation to another passenger, a man whose entire worldview was threatened by the simple fact of their belonging in this premium space. Scotch. Make it a double. Macallan. 18. Not the cheap stuff. The words weren't shouted, but they carried an unmistakable edge of command, the voice of someone accustomed to instant compliance. Thomas Bradford didn't look up as he issued this order to the flight attendant, his attention fixed on the Wall Street Journal spread open across his lap. From seat 3C, Bradford observed the Williams family with undisguised contempt. At 57, he moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who believed he had personally paved its way. His neatly trimmed silver hair complemented the subtle gray at his temples, and his tailored Brioni suit, charcoal with the faintest pinstripe, projected the image he had carefully cultivated throughout his career. Successful real estate developer and senior vice president at Bradford Heritage Properties, a firm founded by his grandfather and expanded by his father. Bradford believed firmly in hierarchies. He believed in an established order that had conveniently placed him and people who looked like him at the very top. His world was one of exclusive country clubs, board of directors meetings, and charity galas where the price of admission ensured he would be surrounded by his kind of people. He'd noticed the Williams family immediately during boarding, his eyes narrowing as they moved with comfortable familiarity through the first-class cabin. What had caught his attention wasn't any specific action. It was their mere presence, their comfort, their belonging. The way Dr. Williams had handed his coat to the flight attendant with easy familiarity, the way the children settled into their seats without wide-eyed amazement, the way Olivia Williams had pulled out her tablet and begun reviewing documents as if the luxury of first class was nothing extraordinary. Bradford took a long sip of his scotch, feeling the familiar burn as it traveled down his throat, warming his chest. His eyes narrowed as he watched Noah Williams make his toy plane soar in gentle loops. "Ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "They're letting anyone in these days." The words were quiet enough to avoid direct confrontation, but loud enough to create a bubble of discomfort for those nearby. It was a practice technique, the verbal equivalent of a paper cut small enough to deny but painful enough to register. Bradford had not always been this way. 20 years earlier, he had lost a major development project to Marcus Garvey Holdings, a black-owned firm whose innovative design had simply been better than Bradford Heritage's proposal. Instead of recognizing the superior work, Bradford had convinced himself the decision was political correctness gone mad. That moment had calcified something in him, a sense that the natural order was being disrupted, that his birthright was under threat. He pulled out his phone and opened his email, typing a quick note to his assistant. Jessica, remind me to write to American about declining standards in first class. Becoming unbearable. The flight attendant returned with his scotch, setting it on his armrest with a cocktail napkin. Will there be anything else, Mr. Bradford? This glass has water spots, he said, not bothering to look up. Bring me a clean one. As the attendant moved away, Bradford's gaze drifted back to the Williams family. The girl was actually reading, not playing on an electronic device. The parents were conversing quietly. The boy was being, Bradford had to admit, relatively well behaved with his toy, but that wasn't the point. The point was that they were here in his space in the cabin he considered his birthright. He had been flying first class since before they were born, he was certain. He had status, a legacy. What did they have? Bradford adjusted his cufflinks, monogrammed platinum pieces that had been his father's, and reached for the Wall Street Journal. The sharp rustle as he snapped it open was deliberate. A small act of sonic intrusion into the quiet bubble the Williams family had created. A notification lit up his phone, a message from Jackson Reynolds, CEO of Reynolds Innovation Group, confirming their meeting in London the following morning. The acquisition deal Bradford had been orchestrating for over a year was finally coming to fruition. A deal worth 9 figures, a deal that would cement his position at the company, perhaps even propel him to CEO when his cousin Alexandra eventually stepped down. Bradford smiled tightly. By this time tomorrow he would be signing papers in Reynolds's London office, overseeing the absorption of a company that would add hundreds of millions to Bradford Heritage's portfolio. This trip wasn't just business, it was his crowning achievement. He glanced again at the Williams family, his irritation momentarily subdued by thoughts of his impending triumph. Let them have their little vacation, he thought. He had bigger concerns, the kind that changed balance sheets and shaped skylines. Little did Bradford know that the true shape of his future was being determined not in a London boardroom, but right here in the first-class cabin of Flight 247, checking oxygen flow, normal. Hydraulic pressure, stable. Flight management computer, initialized and operational. Captain James Sullivan's voice was steady and methodical as he and First Officer Gabriela Morales moved through the pre-flight checklist in the cockpit of American Airlines Flight 247. At 48, the former Navy pilot had logged over 18,000 hours in the air and had been with American Airlines for 15 years. His record was spotless, his reputation among crew members sterling. Outside in the cabin, the pre-flight rituals continued with practiced precision. Sofia Rodriguez moved with elegant efficiency through the first-class section, placing freshly warmed towels on silver trays and ensuring each seat's amenity kit was perfectly positioned. At 34, Sofia had been with the airline for 12 years, working her way up from regional flights to the coveted transatlantic routes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform impeccable, her smile warm but professional. "Can I get you anything else before takeoff, Dr. Williams?" she asked, collecting his empty champagne flute. The crystal caught the cabin light, sending tiny rainbows across the tray table. "No, thank you." "Sophia," Marcus replied, noting her name tag. "We're all set." The scent of heated towels and expensive cologne mingled with the particular plastic and textile smell unique to new aircraft. The soft hum of the auxiliary power unit provided a baseline of white noise beneath the sounds of passengers settling in and overhead compartments being closed with solid thunks. In the cockpit, Captain Sullivan and First Officer Morales continued their preparations. Weather looks clear all the way to the Atlantic. Morales noted her fingers moving deftly across the navigation display. At 36, she was one of the airline's rising stars with exceptional technical skills and an intuitive understanding of aircraft dynamics. We might hit some chop near Newfoundland, but nothing significant. Sullivan nodded his salt and pepper hair, catching the light from the instrument panel. Should be a smooth ride. How's the cabin looking full flight? Sophia says we've got a good mix up front, some regulars, some families. Morales paused, then added with subtle emphasis, Bradford's in 3C. Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but his eyes reflected recognition. Thomas Bradford was well known among the crew, not for pleasant reasons. His previous flights had earned him internal notes for condescending behavior toward flight attendants and complaints about everything from beverage temperature to the accents of non-American crew members. "Let's hope he's in a good mood today," Sullivan said diplomatically, returning to his checklist. But something in his tone suggested he was mentally preparing for potential issues. Back in the cabin, the remaining first-class passengers settled in. In 1A and 1B sat Raymond and Elena Ramirez, a distinguished elderly couple returning from their granddaughter's graduation. Raymond, a retired judge with a dignified bearing and silver hair, helped Elena arrange her cashmere shawl around her shoulders before settling into his own seat with a Spanish-language newspaper. In 4A, Alicia Dominguez, the 28-year-old founder of a successful tech startup specializing in anti-bias AI, was already working on her laptop. Her company had recently secured significant venture capital funding, and this trip to London was to explore European expansion opportunities. 3 years earlier, she had been removed from a first-class cabin despite having a valid ticket and experience that had directly influenced the founding of her company. Today, she watched the interactions around her with the heightened awareness of someone who had experienced discrimination firsthand. "Just water, please," Alicia said to Sophia, glancing up briefly before returning to her work. Her fingers paused momentarily as she noticed Bradford's expression when he looked at the Williams family. Bradford, meanwhile, had flagged down Sophia for the third time. "The ice in this scotch has melted too much," he complained, holding out his glass without making eye contact. "And when will you be serving the warm nuts? They should be out by now." Sophia maintained her professional composure, years of training evident in her ability to keep her expression pleasant despite his tone. "I'll bring you a fresh drink right away, Mr. Bradford. The warm nuts will be served once we reach cruising altitude." Bradford huffed impatiently. "I've been flying first class for 30 years. I know when they're supposed to be served." From across the aisle, Dr. Williams observed the interaction quietly, noting Bradford's dismissive tone and Sophia's graceful handling of the rudeness. As a black physician, he was intimately familiar with the varied ways entitlement and prejudice manifested from the patient who had once asked to see a real doctor to the hospital board member who had expressed surprise at his Harvard credentials. The final preparations for departure continued. The jet bridge disconnected, the cabin door closed with a definitive thunk, and the safety demonstration began. Captain Sullivan's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard Flight 247 to London Heathrow, announcing the flight time of approximately 7 hours and 15 minutes, and advising the cabin crew to prepare for departure. As the massive Boeing aircraft pushed back from the gate, the Williams children looked out the window with excitement. Noah clutched his toy plane tighter, and Zoe pointed out the ground crew's signals to her mother. Their faces bathed in the last golden rays of New York sunlight, filtering through the small oval window. The first-class cabin, designed to be a haven of comfort and luxury, was prepared for a routine transatlantic crossing. But beneath its polished surface, tensions were already simmering, tensions that would soon boil over at 30,000 feet. "We've reached our cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. I've turned off the fasten seatbelt sign, so you're free to move about the cabin." Captain Sullivan's voice faded from the speakers, replaced by the gentle white noise of air circulation and the muted hum of the engines. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, creating an atmosphere of subdued luxury as the aircraft leveled off above a blanket of clouds that stretched to the horizon, turned rose gold by the setting sun. Sophia and her colleague Miguel moved through the aisle with practiced grace, serving warm mixed nuts in small porcelain dishes and taking drink orders for the post-takeoff service. The distinct aroma of toasted almonds and cashews mingled with the cabin's air conditioning, creating that particular scent unique to premium air travel. Zoe Williams had progressed 30 pages into her historical novel, occasionally sharing interesting facts with her mother. "Mom," she whispered, leaning across the aisle, "did you know that during the Great Fire of London in 1666, they used gunpowder to blow up houses to create fire breaks?" Olivia smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "I did know that. When we visit St. Paul's Cathedral, you'll see how the city was rebuilt afterward. Sir Christopher Wren designed it with a dome that looks like it's floating." Zoe's eyes widened with excitement. "Can we climb up to the top? All 528 steps?" Olivia promised, reaching across to squeeze her daughter's hand. Across the aisle, Noah was coloring in his aviation-themed activity book, his toy plane carefully positioned on his tray table as if overseeing his work. Marcus had reclined his seat slightly and was reviewing patient files on his tablet preparation for a presentation he would be giving at a medical conference after their family vacation portion concluded. The blue light of the screen illuminated his focused expression, highlighting the sharp intelligence in his eyes. In 3C, Thomas Bradford was documenting his displeasure. Using the airline's onboard Wi-Fi, he had already sent 3 emails to his assistant, one complaining about the delayed pushback from the gate 2 minutes behind schedule, another about the temperature in the cabin too warm, and a third expressing his frustration with the deteriorating exclusivity of the first-class experience. He had also begun composing a formal complaint to American Airlines Customer Service Department, meticulously noting each perceived deficiency. His current target was the Williams family. "Family with small children allowed in first class," he typed, his fingers stabbing at the screen with unnecessary force. "Disruptive presence. Children not controlled properly. Constant movement and noise making rest impossible." The irony that Noah and Zoe were among the most well-behaved children ever to grace the first-class cabin was lost on Bradford. His perception was filtered through a lens of entitlement and prejudice that transformed their very existence into an offense. In the cockpit, First Officer Gabriela Morales was performing routine checks while Captain Sullivan reviewed their flight path across the Atlantic. "We should hit some light chop near Newfoundland," Sullivan noted, his finger tracing the projected route on the navigation display. "Nothing significant, but might want to give the cabin crew a heads up." Morales nodded, making a note. "I'll let Sophia know. By the way, did you hear anything more about that new protocol they're rolling out? The one for handling on-board conflicts?" Sullivan's eyes remained on the instruments, but his expression became more thoughtful. "Passenger Dignity Protocol. It's still in the pilot phase, no pun intended. Basically gives captains clearer guidelines for dealing with discrimination incidents. I was part of the working group that developed it after that incident on the Dallas flight last year, the one where the passenger refused to sit next to the Muslim family. That's the one." Sullivan checked a gauge before continuing. "Airlines are finally acknowledging that these incidents are increasing. The protocol establishes a framework for response, everything from reseating passengers to diversion decisions." Morales looked thoughtful, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Good. It's about time we had clearer guidance on this." Back in the cabin, Sophia was serving Bradford his requested snack, a cheese plate that he had specified should come with exactly 2 extra water crackers and no fruit. "Here you are, Mr. Bradford," she said, placing the plate on his tray table with precision. Bradford examined it with a critical eye, the overhead lighting glinting off his designer glasses as he leaned forward. "The cheese is cut too thick," he complained, not bothering to lower his voice. "And there's fruit on this plate. I specifically said no fruit." I apologize, Mr. Bradford. Let me fix that for you right away. Sophia's voice remained professional, though the smile no longer reached her eyes. As Sophia took the plate back, Bradford's gaze drifted to the Williams family again. His irritation, which had been simmering since boarding, was beginning to crystallize into something harder and more directed. Every laugh, every exchange between the family members, every moment of their obvious comfort in the first-class cabin seemed to personally diminish him. The pressure differential between the cabin and the outside atmosphere created a subtle tension, a physical manifestation of the social pressure building within the confined space. Outside, the last traces of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, plunging the aircraft into the liminality of night flight, a metal tube suspended between worlds, between time zones, between social realities that were about to collide. "Watch this." Dad Noah Williams' excited whisper carried the unmistakable enthusiasm of childhood. His small hands guided the colorful model airplane in gentle figure eights above his tray table, complete with quiet sound effects. The boy's imagination transformed the cramped confines of the aircraft into vast blue skies, where his toy soared with unlimited freedom. Marcus looked up from his tablet, the patient file temporarily forgotten as he watched his son's creative play. The blue medical diagrams on the screen contrasted with the warm amber cabin lighting that cast everything in a soft golden glow. "That's some expert flying." "Noah Marcus," said his tired eyes, crinkling with genuine pleasure. After 80-hour work weeks of concentration on millimeter-precise surgical movements, these moments with his son felt like pure luxury. The flight had been underway for about 45 minutes. The seatbelt sign had been off for some time, allowing passengers to settle into their routines for the long journey. The distinctive scent of the dinner service being prepared wafted from the galley seared beef-roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread. Noah continued his play, keeping his movements small and his sound effects barely audible, a testament to his parents' careful teaching about considerate behavior in public spaces. But as he leaned slightly to extend his plane's flight path, his small water bottle, which had been placed at the edge of his tray table, tipped over. The sealed plastic bottle tumbled from the tray, bounced once on the premium carpet with a soft thud, and rolled with surprising momentum down the slight incline of the cabin. Its journey ended when it came to rest against the polished leather of Thomas Bradford's Italian loafer. The reaction was immediate and wildly disproportionate. Bradford jerked his foot back as if the harmless water bottle were a venomous snake, his entire body tensing in exaggerated alarm. The sudden motion caused his scotch to slosh in its crystal tumbler, sending a few drops onto the French cuff of his crisp white shirt. "For God's sake," Bradford exclaimed, his voice slicing through the cabin's quiet ambiance. The volume was deliberately loud, designed to draw attention and establish the moment as a significant disruption rather than the minor incident it actually was. Marcus immediately recognized the situation's potential to escalate. With the practiced calm of a surgeon who had faced countless high-pressure scenarios, brain bleeds, tumor complications, coding patients. He unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned forward slightly. "I apologize about that," he said, his voice even and genuinely apologetic. "Noah, can you please retrieve your water bottle?" Noah, startled by Bradford's explosive reaction, nodded quickly. "Yes, Dad." He carefully slipped out of his seat and approached to pick up the bottle, adding a small, sincere, "Sorry, sir." But Bradford wasn't interested in a 6-year-old's apology or a swift resolution. His face had darkened with indignation, a vein visibly pulsing at his temple. His posture had become rigid with affronted dignity, as if the water bottle were a personal attack rather than an accident. "You should keep your children under control," he said, looking directly at Marcus, his voice cold and dismissive. "This isn't a playground." The comment hung in the air between them, weighted with subtext. It wasn't about the water bottle. It was about belonging, about who had the right to occupy this space and who didn't. Sophia, alert to the developing tension, moved smoothly toward their section. Behind her, Miguel discreetly pressed the interphone button, activating the Protocol 27 alert, the cabin crew's internal code for a potential discrimination incident that might require monitoring. His dark eyes met Sophia's briefly, a silent communication based on years of working together. Marcus maintained his composure, though a slight tightening around his eyes betrayed his awareness of the subtext beneath Bradford's comment. His hands that had performed miracles of neurosurgery, rested calmly on his armrests, betraying none of the tension now coursing through him. "He just dropped a water bottle," Sir Marcus replied, his voice still calm but with a new firmness. He apologized. "Let's leave it at that." Bradford's eyes narrowed his gaze, moving deliberately from Marcus to Noah, then to Olivia and Zoe across the aisle. His assessment was pointed and unmistakable, a visual cataloging of a family he deemed out of place. The cabin lights reflected off his gold watch as his hand tightened around his tumbler. "Children don't belong in first class," Bradford stated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Some of us pay a premium for peace and quiet, not to be disturbed by families who clearly aren't used to this kind of environment. The coded language was as thick as mud, aren't used to this kind of environment." The implication was clear to everyone within earshot. Sophia intervened with professional grace, the scent of her subtle perfume momentarily cutting through the tension as she stepped between the seats. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice pleasant but alert. Bradford seized on her arrival as an opportunity to legitimize his complaint. "No, everything is not all right," he declared, pointing toward Noah, who had retreated to the safety of his father's side. "This child is running around throwing things. It's completely unacceptable. I paid for a first-class ticket, which is supposed to mean a first-class experience." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. With a subtle movement, he adjusted his watch, discreetly tapping the crown twice to activate its recording function, a habit born from previous experiences where his version of events had been questioned or dismissed. "That is an absolute mischaracterization," Marcus stated firmly. "My son dropped a water bottle. That's it." He picked it up and apologized. "There was no running and nothing was thrown." Sophia assessed the situation quickly, noting Noah's distressed expression and Bradford's aggressive posture. She had witnessed similar scenarios before, complaints that had less to do with actual disruption and more to do with who was perceived as belonging in premium cabins. "I understand, sir," she said to Bradford, maintaining her professional tone. "I can assure you it was just an accident. Perhaps we can all take a moment to—" Bradford cut her off, his hand slicing through the air dismissively. "I don't want platitudes. I want something done. These people are disrupting the entire cabin." The phrase "these people" hung in the air, heavy with implication. A few seats away, Raymond Ramirez lowered his newspaper, his experienced judge's eyes narrowing at Bradford's choice of words. Across the aisle, Alicia Dominguez had removed her headphones, her attention caught by the escalating exchange. The confrontation was no longer a private disagreement. It was becoming a spectacle, exactly what Bradford seemed to want. The catalyst had been provided, and the stage was set for a conflict that would soon engulf the entire first-class cabin. "I'm sorry. Did you just say these people?" Olivia Williams's voice cut through the tension with precision, like a perfectly honed blade. She had unbuckled her seatbelt and risen to her full height, her expression a mixture of disbelief and controlled anger. The cabin lighting caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes, making them seem to burn with intensity. As an accomplished professional who had navigated predominantly white spaces her entire career, she had developed a finely tuned ear for the subtle and not-so-subtle language of exclusion. The temperature in the cabin seemed to rise several degrees as all eyes turned toward the confrontation. Bradford's face flushed, not with shame, but with the indignation of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. His collar suddenly felt tight against his neck, a physical manifestation of his discomfort at having his prejudice named directly. "I said exactly what I meant." He snapped, droplets of saliva flying from his lips. This is a premium cabin with standards. Your child is disruptive, and you're defending it instead of controlling him." Marcus had also stood now, positioning himself slightly in front of Noah in a protective stance. His height, 6'2", suddenly became apparent as he straightened to his full stature. Though his expression remained composed, his eyes had hardened to obsidian, reflecting none of the cabin light. "My son dropped a water bottle," Marcus stated, his voice measured but carrying an unmistakable undertone of authority that had silenced many a hospital boardroom. He apologized. "The only person disrupting this cabin right now is you with your disproportionate reaction and thinly veiled comments." Bradford's face contorted with outrage, the muscles in his neck standing out like cords. "How dare you? I am a Platinum Executive Medallion member. I've flown over 2 million miles with this airline. I know my rights." The statement hung absurdly in the air, as if frequent flyer status conferred special permission for bigotry. From nearby, the distinct sound of a phone camera shutter clicked softly. Sophia stepped between them, her professional training kicking in as she attempted to de-escalate the situation. The scent of her perfume, subtle notes of vanilla and jasmine briefly cut through the increasingly tense atmosphere. "Gentlemen, please," she said, raising her hand slightly in a calming gesture. "Let's keep our voices down for the comfort of all passengers." But Bradford wasn't interested in de-escalation. He was building toward something, each exchange fueling his righteous indignation. "I want to speak to the purser. Now. This is unacceptable." Across the aisle, Zoe Williams had shrunk into her seat. Her book clutched to her chest, eyes wide as she watched the adults' confrontation. The historical novel about the Great Fire of London lay forgotten as she witnessed a very different kind of burning. Elena Ramirez, noticing the child's distress, offered a reassuring smile from her seat, a small gesture of solidarity that bridged the space between them. Meanwhile, Alicia Dominguez had subtly positioned her phone on her armrest, its camera lens capturing the unfolding scene. Her finger hovered over the upload button, hesitant but ready. The cabin air felt electric, charged with tension that seemed to crackle between the confronting parties. Sir Sophia addressed Bradford, her voice maintaining its professional calm despite the flush spreading across her cheeks. "I am the purser for this cabin. I can assure you that no policies have been violated. Dr. Williams and his family have every right to be here with their confirmed first-class tickets." Bradford's expression darkened at the mention of Marcus's title. "Doctor," he scoffed the word, dripping with skepticism. "And what kind of doctor would that be?" The question was laden with assumptions, a subtle attempt to undermine the Williams family's legitimacy in the first-class cabin by questioning Marcus's professional credentials. "I'm a pediatric neurosurgeon," Marcus replied evenly, the slight accent on certain syllables revealing traces of his Baltimore upbringing. "Though I fail to see how my profession is relevant to your complaint about a dropped water bottle." Bradford's demeanor shifted slightly, the information momentarily disrupting his narrative. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features before his entitlement reasserted itself. "Well, doctor, you should know better than to let your children run wild in a confined space." "My children are not running wild," Marcus stated, his patience visibly wearing thin despite his controlled tone. "They have been quieter and more considerate than many adults I've encountered on flights. Including you at this moment." Bradford's face flushed a deeper red, the color extending to the tips of his ears. Small beads of sweat had formed along his hairline despite the cabin's cool temperature. "Are you calling me inconsiderate? This is harassment." The irony of his accusation was not lost on anyone witnessing the exchange. Miguel had returned and was standing near Sophia, both of them carefully monitoring the situation while maintaining professional expressions. "No one is harassing you, sir." "Sophia," interjected the subtle strain in her voice, betraying the effort it took to remain professional. "But I do need to ask everyone to lower their voices and return to their seats." Bradford wasn't finished. He pointed a finger directly at Marcus, the digit trembling slightly with the force of his emotion. I paid extra for this cabin specifically to avoid disruptions like your family. People who clearly aren't accustomed to first-class etiquette shouldn't be here." The statement hung in the air, its implication unmistakable. The cabin had grown so quiet that the subtle hum of the aircraft's engines seemed suddenly loud by comparison. Raymond Ramirez cleared his throat loudly, the sound disrupting the tense silence. "Young man," he addressed Bradford, his voice carrying the gravitas of his years on the bench. "I believe your comments are bordering on inappropriate. The only disruption I've witnessed is coming from your seat." Bradford's head snapped toward Ramirez, his expression betraying surprise at this new front in a battle he'd assumed was contained. "This doesn't concern you." "Civility always concerns me," Ramirez replied calmly, folding his newspaper with deliberate precision. The gold of his wedding band caught the light as he set the paper aside. The cabin had grown unnaturally quiet. Other first-class passengers were now openly watching the confrontation, their expressions ranging from discomfort to disgust, most of it directed at Bradford. Olivia placed a hand on her husband's arm, a gesture of support rather than restraint. The diamond in her wedding ring sparkled under the cabin lights. "Marcus," she said quietly, "this isn't worth our energy." But Bradford seized on her comment, his lips curling into a sneer. "Yes, Marcus," he mimicked with exaggerated inflection. "Listen to your wife. Take your family and move to where you belong." The phrase "where you belong" echoed in the cabin, its meaning crystal clear to everyone present. The overhead reading lights seemed to intensify, spotlighting the confrontation as if on a stage. In row 4, Alicia Dominguez had begun typing rapidly on her phone, the hashtag #FirstClassRacism appearing in her draft social media post alongside the video she'd captured. Her fingers moved with purpose, her face set in determined lines. The confrontation had transcended a simple dispute about a water bottle. It had become something far uglier, a public display of prejudice at 38,000 feet with witnesses' recordings and no easy escape for anyone involved. "I've had enough of this farce." Bradford's voice had taken on a dangerous edge like steel wrapped in silk. He stood abruptly, his napkin falling to the floor as he rose to his full height. The motion sent his scotch tumbling amber liquid splashing across his tray table and dripping onto the carpet below. "I demand that you move this family to economy, where they won't disturb the premium passengers who actually belong here." The statement was so explicitly offensive that it seemed to suspend the normal flow of time and social convention. The ambient sounds of the aircraft, the gentle hum of engines, the subtle whoosh of air circulation seemed to fade momentarily as passengers processed Bradford's audacious demand. Sophia's professional mask slipped for just an instant, revealing a flash of genuine shock before she regained her composure. Her earrings, small silver hoops, caught the light as she took an instinctive step back, physically distancing herself from Bradford's ugliness. "Sir," she said, her voice firm, and without its usual warmth, "that request is inappropriate and against airline policy. The Williams family has legitimate first-class tickets and will not be moved." The aroma of spilled scotch permeated the immediate area, its peaty scent a sharp counterpoint to the tension. Bradford's face had taken on a mottled quality, patches of red against sudden pallor, indicating his elevated blood pressure. "I am a top-tier loyalty member who spends tens of thousands of dollars with this airline annually," he declared, each word precise and clipped. "Their comfort cannot take precedence over mine." "This isn't about comfort," Marcus Williams stated, his voice controlled but carrying a dangerous edge. "This is about your belief that we don't belong here because of how we look." Bradford scoffed theatrically, his hands gesturing wildly. "Don't play the race card. This is about behavior and standards." "No," Marcus replied, each word precise and measured like a carefully administered medication. "This is about you seeing a black family in first class and deciding we must be breaking some unwritten rule. Your prejudice isn't my problem." He paused, then delivered a line that seemed to crystallize the entire confrontation. "I repair children's brains for a living. Fixing your prejudice isn't in my skill set." A few seats away, Alicia Dominguez mouthed, "Damn," silently as she continued recording. This moment, this perfect crystallization of dignified resistance was exactly why she had kept her camera rolling. Bradford wasn't deterred. If anything, being directly confronted about his prejudice only fueled his indignation. "This is outrageous. I will not be accused of... I have colleagues who are... This is absolutely..." He sputtered, unable to complete any of his defensive statements. The taste of bile rose in his throat, bitter and acidic, as his carefully constructed self-image collided with the reality of his behavior. But rather than prompting reflection, this discomfort only intensified his anger. Sir Sophia interjected her stance, now more assertive, as she positioned herself slightly between Bradford and the Williams family. "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice and return to your seat. You're disturbing the entire cabin. I will not sit down." Bradford nearly shouted, his voice cracking slightly on the final word. "I paid for peace and quiet. I paid to be surrounded by a certain caliber of passenger. I want the captain involved immediately." Demanding the captain was the nuclear option. It was a line that once crossed could not be uncrossed. Every flight attendant knew this. The cockpit was sacrosanct. The captain's authority was absolute. Bradford, in his arrogance, was trying to weaponize it. Miguel, who had been standing nearby, made eye contact with Sophia and gave a slight nod. The situation had escalated beyond cabin crew management. He stepped away to contact the cockpit, his movements quick and purposeful. Olivia Williams had moved to stand protectively near Zoe, who was watching the confrontation with wide, worried eyes. The girl's small fingers had creased the pages of her book, a physical manifestation of her anxiety. "Mom," Zoe whispered, her voice carrying in a momentary lull in the confrontation. "Why is that man so angry at us?" The question, innocent, direct, and heartbreaking, hung in the air. Several passengers visibly winced at the reminder that children were witnessing this ugly display of adult prejudice. Olivia bent down to her daughter's eye level, her voice gentle but clear enough to be heard. "Some people carry anger inside them that has nothing to do with us, sweetheart. We know who we are and where we belong." Bradford sneered, his lips curling back to reveal clenched teeth. "Where you belong is at the back of the plane, not up here pretending to be first class." The statement was so explicitly offensive that several passengers gasped audibly. Raymond Ramirez muttered something that sounded like disgraceful, while his wife Elena crossed herself, reflexively, gold crucifix glinting at her neck. Marcus's expression hardened to granite, but his voice remained steady, resonating with the authority that had guided surgical teams through life and death operations. "My family and I will remain exactly where we are, where our tickets entitle us to be. Your opinion on the matter is irrelevant. We'll see about that," Bradford retorted, his voice dangerous. "I'm not the one who'll be removed from this flight." The threat hung in the air, explicit and unmistakable. Bradford truly believed he had the power to have the Williams family ejected from the premium cabin or from the flight entirely simply because he deemed them unworthy of sharing his space. Sophia stepped closer to Miguel as he returned from the interphone. "Status," she asked quietly, the word barely audible. "Code Delta initiated," he replied in an undertone. "Captain is aware." Sophia nodded once, understanding the significance. Code Delta, the discrimination emergency protocol had been activated. The situation had officially escalated beyond cabin crew management. It was now a flight deck issue, a potential security concern that required the captain's direct involvement and decision-making. The confrontation had reached a critical juncture. Bradford stood in the aisle, red-faced and quivering with self-righteous anger. The Williams family remained composed but unwavering. And throughout the first-class cabin, passengers and crew watched with the collective understanding that they were witnessing something that would extend far beyond this flight. something with consequences that would reverberate long after they touched down in London. The air feels different now. Elena Ramirez whispered these words to her husband, her fingers interlacing with his. It wasn't just a figure of speech, the cabin atmosphere had physically changed. The recycled air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, as if the tension had altered its molecular structure. "Would everyone please return to their seats?" Sophia requested, her voice carrying quiet authority. "The captain has been informed of the situation and is reviewing appropriate responses." The overhead lights reflected off the polished surfaces of the cabin, the gleaming wood veneer, the brushed metal accents, the crystal glassware, creating an environment that should have signaled luxury and calm, but now felt like a pressure cooker with no release valve. Most passengers had abandoned any pretense of not watching the confrontation. Tablets and books lay forgotten on tray tables. Headphones had been removed. Everyone was now a witness to the ugliness that had erupted in their midst, the privileged bubble of first-class travel, irrevocably punctured by the reality of prejudice. Bradford remained standing, though he had moved slightly back toward his seat. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his face flushed with the peculiar combination of self-righteousness and embarrassment that often accompanies public displays of prejudice. Small beads of sweat had formed along his hairline despite the cabin's controlled temperature. "This is still America," he muttered, just loudly enough to be heard. "I have rights as a customer." The words echoed hollowly in the confined space, revealing the poverty of his worldview, one that confused purchasing power with permission to demean others. From 1B, Elena Ramirez spoke up, her voice carrying the slight accent of her native Colombia, but commanding attention nonetheless. Her silver hair caught the cabin light as she turned toward Bradford. "Sir, as someone who became an American citizen 40 years ago, let me assure you the right to humiliate a family because of their race is not among the freedoms this country promises." The gold crucifix at her neck caught the light as she spoke, lending her words an almost spiritual authority. Her husband Raymond nodded in agreement, the gesture subtle but deliberate. "In my 30 years on the bench," he added, his judicial voice carrying without being raised, "I saw many who confused privilege with rights. They are not the same." Bradford's head swiveled toward the elderly couple, his expression darkening further at finding another source of opposition rather than the alliance he clearly expected. The veins in his neck stood out prominently as he struggled to maintain his position. "You don't understand. This isn't about their trying to make it seem like—" "We all heard what you said," Alicia Dominguez interjected from her seat, her phone still visible in her hand. The screen's blue light illuminated her determined expression. "And what you meant." Bradford's eyes widened as he noticed the phone. "Are you recording this? That's invasion of privacy. You can't. This is a public space," Alicia replied calmly. "There's no expectation of privacy in a commercial aircraft cabin." The intervention of other passengers created a ripple effect through the cabin. Bradford's isolated confrontation with the Williams family had evolved into a cabin-wide referendum on acceptable behavior. Bradford was no longer facing down a single family. He was now opposed by a growing coalition of disgusted fellow passengers. Marcus Williams had guided his son back to his seat, whispering reassurances as he helped the boy fasten his seatbelt. Noah's small hands trembled slightly as he clutched his toy airplane. All enthusiasm for play vanished in the face of adult conflict. Across the aisle, Zoe had curled against her mother, her young face a mixture of confusion and hurt. The sight of the children, innocent bystanders affected by an adult's prejudice, seemed to further unite the cabin against Bradford. Sophia moved through the space with deliberate calm, checking on passengers, offering water, projecting stability amid the tension. The ice in the glasses clinked softly as she placed them on tray tables, the sound jarring in the charged atmosphere. "The captain will make a decision shortly," she informed Bradford, her tone neutral but firm. "In the meantime, I need you to return to your seat." Bradford's posture remained defiant, his chin raised slightly in a gesture of superiority that seemed increasingly hollow. I'm not sitting down until something is done about this situation. They need to be moved. The only person creating a situation is you, Marcus stated from his seat, his arm protectively around Noah. My family hasn't violated any policy or regulation. You're the only one disturbing this cabin. Bradford pointed a finger accusingly. You're playing the victim. This is reverse discrim. Sir Sophia's sharp interruption prevented the completion of his offensive claim. Return to your seat immediately, or I will need to report continued non-compliance to the captain. The explicit mention of non-compliance, a term with specific implications for air travel, finally penetrated Bradford's righteous bubble. Airlines had strict protocols for handling disruptive passengers, and the post-9/11 environment gave these protocols significant weight. With visible reluctance, Bradford lowered himself into his seat, though he remained perched on its edge like a predator ready to spring. The leather creaked beneath him as he shifted uncomfortably, his body language radiating tension. This isn't over. He muttered the words emerging through clenched teeth. Miguel approached Sophia and murmured something in her ear. She nodded once, then addressed the cabin with professional composure. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. Captain Sullivan is aware of the situation and will address it shortly. In the meantime, we'll be continuing our meal service. Thank you for your patience. This seemingly routine announcement carried significant subtext for those familiar with airline operations. The mention of the captain by name and the commitment to addressing the situation shortly indicated that decisions were being made, serious ones, about how to handle what had occurred. In the Williams family's row, Olivia leaned across the aisle toward Marcus. You okay? She asked quietly, her eyes conveying a complex mixture of concern, pride, and solidarity. Marcus nodded once his expression controlled, but his eyes conveying a complex mix of anger, determination, and concern for his children. He glanced at his watch, confirming it was still recording then at Bradford, who was now furiously typing on his phone, presumably documenting his version of events to airline customer service or social media. What no one in the cabin yet realized was that the confrontation had already escaped the contained environment of Flight 247. Alicia Dominguez's video clip, hastily uploaded during a moment when Sophia's attention was elsewhere, had begun its viral journey across the internet. The hashtags #FirstClass, racism, and #FlightJustice were already gathering momentum, with the view count climbing rapidly as the clip was shared, commented on, and amplified. The flight had been in the air for less than 2 hours. Their destination was still over the mid-Atlantic. But the story of what happened on American Airlines Flight 247 was already taking flight in ways none of them could have anticipated. Breathe. Just breathe. Sophia Rodriguez whispered the mantra to herself as she stood in the forward galley, her hands gripping the edges of the stainless steel counterhead, bowed slightly as she took a moment to compose herself. The cool metal against her palms provided a grounding sensation as she struggled to process the escalating situation in her cabin. 20 minutes had passed since Bradford's explosive demand that the Williams family be moved to where they belong. The cabin had settled into an uneasy ceasefire, with Bradford sullenly reviewing documents on his tablet, while the Williams family attempted to salvage their children's first international flight experience. The galley offered a momentary refuge a few square feet where Sophia could drop her professional mask for just seconds before returning to the fray. The familiar scents of coffee and warming meals provided an illusion of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the charged atmosphere just beyond the curtain. You okay? Miguel asked quietly, pausing in his preparation of the meal service trays. His concerned eyes met hers as he arranged silverware with practiced efficiency. Sophia exhaled slowly, releasing a fraction of the tension that had built between her shoulder blades. I've dealt with difficult passengers before, but this? She shook her head, a strand of dark hair escaping her neat bun. The way he looked at that family, the things he said, it was so blatant. The dilemma facing Sophia went beyond standard customer service challenges. As the lead flight attendant for the first-class cabin, she was responsible for passenger comfort and safety. but this situation had ethical dimensions that transcended the airline's service manual. Sophia's mind flashed back to a flight 5 years earlier, Dallas to Phoenix, an otherwise forgettable Tuesday afternoon service. She had been newer then, still eager to please, still believing that the customer is always right was an inviolable law rather than a flawed guideline. She had been the only Hispanic crew member that day working the premium cabin where a passenger had complained about being seated next to a woman in a hijab. The passenger had used the same phrase, certain caliber, that Bradford had just employed, and Sophia had accommodated his request for a seat change, telling herself she was simply resolving a conflict efficiently. The Muslim woman's expression when she realized what was happening had haunted Sophia ever since the quiet dignity, the resigned understanding that even in the neutral space of an aircraft cabin she was still considered other. What had made it worse was the realization as the flight progressed that several passengers assumed Sophia had made the decision because she shared the man's prejudices. Her uniform hadn't shielded her from being grouped with the bigot rather than his target. Sophia had never made that mistake again. She had learned that neutrality in the face of discrimination wasn't professionalism, it was complicity. The memory of that woman's eyes still visited her in quiet moments, a reminder that actions had consequences far beyond immediate convenience. "Captain's asking for an update," Miguel said, interrupting her thoughts as he handed her the interphone. The polished handset felt cool against her palm as she took it. She straightened her posture and took the handset. "This is Sophia." Captain Sullivan's voice came through clearly, the connection crackling slightly with static. "Sophia, I need your assessment of the situation in first class." Sophia turned slightly away from Miguel, lowering her voice, though still keeping it professional and clear. The passenger in 3C, Thomas Bradford, made explicitly discriminatory comments toward the Williams family in 2A through D, she reported. He demanded they be moved to economy based solely on his belief that they don't belong in first class. When I refused, he became agitated and requested captain intervention. He's currently complying with the seatbelt sign but continues to make comments within earshot of the family. A slight pause. "Are the Williams children okay?" The question reflected Sullivan's reputation for considering all dimensions of a situation, not just policy compliance, but human impact. It was one of the reasons crew members requested to fly with him whenever possible. "They're upset," Sophia answered honestly, the words catching slightly in her throat as she recalled Zoe's confused expression, trying to be brave, but they've clearly been affected. Dr. Williams has remained remarkably composed given the circumstances, but this is affecting their entire trip, and other passengers, most seem disgusted by Bradford's behavior. The Ramirez couple and Ms. Dominguez in particular have spoken up in the Williams family's defense. No one has supported Bradford's position. There was a brief pause before Sullivan spoke again. In the background, Sophia could hear the subtle sounds of the cockpit, the occasional beep of instruments, the soft murmur of First Officer Morales communicating with air traffic control. "I understand Bradford has a history of difficult behavior on previous flights." "Yes," Sophia confirmed, remembering the internal notes attached to his customer profile. "He's been flagged in the system before for condescending treatment of crew members, particularly female crew members of color." Another pause. Sophia could almost hear the captain weighing options, calculating variables, considering the complex matrix of regulations, company policy, passenger rights, and basic human decency that would inform his decision. Sophia Sullivan finally said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "I'm initiating passenger dignity protocol. Document everything that's occurred and have Miguel ready the incident forms. I'll be making an announcement shortly." Sophia felt a momentary surge of relief mixed with apprehension. The Passenger Dignity Protocol was new, a framework developed specifically to address discrimination incidents on board. Its activation indicated that Captain Sullivan was taking the situation with the utmost seriousness. "Understood, Captain," she replied, her professional tone masking the emotional weight of the moment. As she hung up the interphone, Sophia noticed Bradford approaching the galley, his expression set in lines of entitlement and determination. His cologne, an expensive, overpowering scent, reached her before he did, mixing unpleasantly with the galley's food aromas. "I need to speak with you," he demanded without preamble, his voice pitched low but intense. "This situation is completely unacceptable. I've been a loyal customer for decades, and I expect to be treated with appropriate respect." Sophia turned to face him fully, her professional mask firmly in place despite the anger simmering beneath. "Mr. Bradford, I'm preparing for meal service. If you have concerns, I'm happy to discuss them after we've served the cabin." Bradford stepped closer, his physical presence deliberately intimidating as he used his height advantage to loom over her. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the tight lines around his mouth and eyes. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I could buy and sell this airline if I wanted to. I have contacts on the board of directors. One call from me and you'll be serving drinks on regional puddle jumpers for the rest of your career. Now, are you going to address my complaints about that family, or do I need to escalate this further?" The threat was explicit and personal, his breath hot against her face as he invaded her personal space. Sophia felt a flash of anger quickly suppressed by years of training. She had worked too hard, overcome too many obstacles to be intimidated by another entitled passenger, wielding his status like a weapon. "Mr. Bradford," she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Threatening a crew member is a violation of federal aviation regulations. I need you to return to your seat immediately." Bradford's face darkened, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. The galley lights reflected off his designer glasses as he leaned even close enough that she could see the individual pores on his nose. "You're making a serious mistake," he hissed, spittle flecking his lips. "When we land in London, I'll be filing a formal complaint about your unprofessional conduct and obvious bias. You can say goodbye to your job." As he turned to stalk back to his seat, Sophia made a decision that transcended procedure and entered the realm of moral clarity. She reached for the interphone again and pressed the direct line to the cockpit, the plastic cool against her suddenly sweaty palm. "Captain," she said. When Sullivan answered, her voice controlled but urgent. "Bradford just approached me in the galley and made explicit threats about my employment if I don't accede to his demands. He mentioned having contacts on the board of directors and implied he could have me fired." Sullivan's response was immediate and resolute, the static on the line doing nothing to diminish the steel in his voice. "Understood. That crosses another line. We're moving to phase 2 of the protocol. Stand by." As Sophia replaced the handset, she felt a curious sense of calm descend. The galley lights seemed brighter, suddenly the edges of counters and equipment sharper and more defined. In choosing dignity over appeasement, justice over convenience, she had aligned herself with values deeper than customer satisfaction metrics or job security. Whatever happened next, she knew she had made the right decision, not just as a flight attendant, but as a human being witnessing injustice and refusing to be complicit in it. The weight of that Muslim woman's resigned gaze from 5 years ago seemed to lift slightly from her conscience. The aircraft continued its steady progress across the Atlantic, the gentle vibration of the engines a constant reminder of movement forward. But the currents of consequence set in motion by Bradford's prejudice and Sophia's principles were about to change its course in ways none of them had anticipated. A captain's authority ends where human dignity begins. The words had been spoken by James Sullivan's flight instructor 26 years earlier during his naval aviation training. They had stayed with him throughout his career, a guiding principle that informed his approach to command. Sullivan. The single word spoken with quiet authority into the cockpit interphone conveyed both identity and command. Captain James Sullivan listened intently as Sophia described Bradford's threatening behavior in the galley, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as she relayed the passenger's attempt to intimidate her with claims of board connections. The cockpit was a sanctuary of controlled sound, the gentle hum of avionics, the occasional burst of radio communication, the subtle clicks and whirs of automated systems doing their work. Outside the windscreen, the vast Atlantic stretched beneath them, its darkness broken only by the distant lights of another aircraft passing far below a brief constellation in the void. At 48, Sullivan embodied a particular type of leadership, one forged in naval aviation, tempered by thousands of hours commanding commercial aircraft, and defined by an unwavering commitment to what he privately termed the right thing over the easy thing. His record at American Airlines was spotless, his technical skills exemplary, but it was his moral compass that had earned him the deepest respect among crew members. Sullivan had joined the Navy straight out of high school, driven by a combination of patriotism and a desire to escape the limited horizons of his small Pennsylvania hometown. The son of a steelworker and a nurse, he had grown up understanding both the dignity of labor and the importance of service. He had expected to serve a standard enlistment. Instead, he discovered both a natural aptitude for aviation and a purpose that would shape his life. 15 years, 2 combat deployments, and countless flight hours later, he transitioned to commercial aviation, bringing with him the Navy's exacting standards and clear ethical framework. His philosophy of leadership had been shaped by a formative experience early in his naval career. During a training exercise, Sullivan had witnessed a superior officer berate a junior enlisted sailor for a minor infraction using racist language in the process. While other officers looked away uncomfortably, Sullivan had stepped forward, risking his own career to intervene. "That man is wearing the same uniform as you and me, sir," he had said to the stunned officer. "He deserves to be corrected properly, not demeaned." The incident had nearly derailed Sullivan's promising career, but a fair-minded commanding officer had recognized the moral courage it represented. The experience taught him that leadership wasn't about rank or authority, it was about moral courage and the willingness to stand for what's right, even at personal cost. This principle had guided his approach to the captain's chair at American Airlines. Sullivan viewed the aircraft as more than a vessel of transportation. It was a temporary community under his stewardship, one where every passenger and crew member deserved equal dignity and protection. He had faced similar situations before. 3 years earlier, on a flight from Chicago to San Francisco, a visibly intoxicated business-class passenger had made inappropriate advances toward a female flight attendant, escalating to verbal abuse when rejected. Sullivan had diverted to Denver, where the passenger was removed by airport police. The diversion had cost the airline thousands of dollars and disrupted hundreds of passengers' schedules, but Sullivan never questioned his decision. Safety, including psychological safety, was non-negotiable. More recently, he had been involved in developing the airline's new Passenger Dignity Protocol, a framework created specifically to address the increasing incidence of discrimination on board. Sullivan had advocated forcefully for clear guidelines that empowered captains to take decisive action, rather than forcing crews to tolerate abuse in the name of customer satisfaction. Now, listening to Sophia's account of Bradford's behavior, Sullivan mentally reviewed the protocol's decision matrix. The situation clearly met multiple criteria for intervention: explicitly discriminatory language refusal to comply with crew instructions, intimidation of crew members, and creation of a hostile environment for other passengers. The options before him ranged from reseating either Bradford or the Williams family, though the latter would effectively reward discrimination, to issuing a formal warning to diverting the aircraft for passenger removal. Each option carried consequences: operational, financial, and reputational. Sullivan glanced at the navigation display, the green line of their programmed route stretching across the digital representation of the Atlantic. They were approximately 1/3 of the way across, just past the eastern edge of Canadian airspace, heading for the vast open ocean. A diversion now would mean turning back to Halifax or St. John's, the last feasible airports, before committing to the oceanic crossing. The decision window was closing rapidly. Once they passed a certain point, turning back would become impractical, and they would be committed to continuing to Europe with Bradford on board. First Officer Gabriela Morales had been monitoring communications while handling routine flight duties. The soft glow from the instruments illuminated her focused expression as she looked over at Sullivan, reading the gravity in his features. "Bad?" she asked simply. Sullivan nodded once. "Bradford threatened Sophia, claimed he has board connections and could end her career if she doesn't move the Williams family to economy." Morales's expression hardened, her hands momentarily stilling on the controls. Like Sullivan, she had zero tolerance for passengers who threatened crew members. "That crosses a line." "It does." Sullivan checked their position again, mentally calculating fuel requirements, time implications, and notification procedures. "We've got about 10 minutes before we need to decide about diverting." The weight of command settled on his shoulders, not uncomfortably, but with familiar gravity. This was why he occupied the left seat, not just for his ability to fly the aircraft, but for his willingness to make difficult decisions when required. Sullivan thought of the Williams children, their first international trip now marred by ugliness. He thought of Dr. Williams, a man who saved children's lives, being humiliated in front of his own family. He thought of Sophia, a consummate professional, being threatened for simply doing her job with integrity. And he thought of Bradford, a man who clearly believed his status and skin color entitled him to dictate who belonged in premium cabins and who did not. The choice, when viewed through the lens of Sullivan's principles, wasn't really a choice at all. It was simply a matter of how not, whether to enforce the boundaries of decent behavior. He reached for the interphone again. "Sophia, this is the captain. We're initiating Phase 2 of the protocol. I'll be making an announcement shortly. Prepare the cabin." As he replaced the handset, Morales was already pulling up the diversion checklist, anticipating his decision with the intuitive understanding of a well-matched flight crew. Sullivan nodded his appreciation for her professionalism, then began the process that would turn a routine transatlantic flight into a powerful statement about dignity, consequences, and the true meaning of first class. "What's our fuel situation if we divert to Halifax?" Captain Sullivan's question cut through the cockpit's ambient sounds, the subtle whir of circulation fans, the occasional ping of automated systems, the gentle hum of the massive engines that kept them suspended between continents. Outside, stars punctuated the vast darkness above, while moonlight silvered the cloud tops far below. First Officer Gabriela Morales consulted the fuel management system, her fingers moving efficiently across the screen. The blue-green glow illuminated her focused expression as she analyzed the data. "We have plenty of margin for Halifax," she reported, the technical certainty in her voice providing a counterpoint to the human uncertainty of the situation they were facing. "We'd need to dump approximately 20,000 pounds for landing weight compliance, but weather's clear for the procedure. We'd still have the required reserves plus contingency." Sullivan nodded mentally, calculating the cascading effects of a diversion. Turning back now meant delays for 211 passengers' crew, scheduling disruptions, accommodations for those who would miss connections, and significant operational costs for the airline. The financial impact alone would run to 6 figures. It wasn't a decision to be made lightly, even with clear justification. Sullivan had diverted aircraft before for mechanical issues and medical emergencies, all clear-cut situations with established protocols. This was different, a judgment call based not on physical safety, but on human dignity and the integrity of the shared space he commanded. "Let's review the protocol checklist," he said, pulling up the electronic document on his tablet. The Passenger Dignity Protocol provided a structured framework for assessing discrimination incidents and determining appropriate response as a tool to ensure that such decisions weren't arbitrary but based on clear criteria. Discriminatory language or behavior. Sullivan read the first criterion, the tablet's light casting shadows across his face. Confirmed, Morales replied, her tone shifting from technical to evaluative. Multiple witnesses reported explicitly racist statements about where the family belongs. Refusal to comply with crew instructions confirmed. Sophia reported he initially refused to return to his seat and continued arguing after being asked to stop. Creating a hostile environment for other passengers confirmed. The Williams children are distressed, and other passengers have expressed discomfort with his behavior. Intimidation or threats toward crew or passengers confirmed. He directly threatened Sophia's employment and attempted to use claimed connections to intimidate her. Sullivan continued through the checklist, methodically establishing that Bradford's behavior had violated multiple threshold criteria for intervention. The protocol recommended a graduated response starting with formal warnings and escalating to removal if necessary. He's already been warned by Sophia, Sullivan noted, scrolling through the document, and instead of de-escalating, he escalated by threatening her. Morales nodded in agreement, moonlight briefly illuminating her face as they passed through a gap in the cloud cover. That's a critical threshold in the protocol. Threats against crew automatically elevate the response level. They had reached the decision point. Sullivan sat silently for a moment, weighing all factors. As captain, he had near absolute authority over the aircraft and everyone aboard. With that authority came the responsibility to use it judiciously. We need to consider alternatives, he said, not because he was uncertain, but because thorough consideration was part of good command. Could we isolate Bradford? Move him to a different cabin? Morales shook her head, her earrings catching the instrument light as she moved. That would put him in closer proximity to economy passengers and potentially expose more people to his behavior. And it sends the wrong message that first class is reserved for certain passengers, exactly the prejudice he's expressing. What about moving the Williams family to business class as an upgrade, not a downgrade? Same problem, Morales replied, her brow furrowing. It rewards Bradford's behavior by giving him what he wants, a first-class cabin without the family he objects to. And it punishes the Williams family for being victims of discrimination. They'd know exactly why they were being moved regardless of how we framed it. Sullivan nodded, having anticipated these conclusions, but needing to verbalize the alternatives for proper procedure. The cockpit felt smaller, suddenly the responsibility of command more tangible. So we're left with either continuing with Bradford on board, issuing a final warning, or diverting to remove him. The protocol is clear. Morales said, her tone professional, but with an undercurrent of conviction. Threats against crew members combined with discriminatory behavior that has continued despite warnings meet the criteria for removal. Sullivan made his decision, the weight of it settling on him not as a burden but as a responsibility fulfilled. Contact Oceanic Control. Advise them we're turning back due to a disruptive passenger. Request clearance for Halifax. As Morales began the communication, the subtle shift in her posture revealing her support for the decision, Sullivan calculated their new route. The diversion would add approximately 3 hours to the journey for the remaining passengers, assuming they could get prompt refueling and clearance for continuation to London after Bradford's removal. Oceanic Control confirms, Morales reported after completing the radio exchange. We're cleared to reverse course for Halifax. They're coordinating with Canadian authorities for security presence upon arrival. Sullivan adjusted their heading, the massive aircraft responding to his commands with graceful precision as it began a wide turn back toward the North American continent. The physical act of turning the plane around seemed to underscore the moral imperative of his decision. Sometimes moving forward meant going back to address what was wrong. We should brief the rest of the crew before I make the passenger announcement, Sullivan said, reaching for the interphone. They'll need to be prepared for Bradford's reaction. It won't be pleasant. Morales nodded in agreement, her hands moving efficiently across the controls as she adjusted their flight parameters for the new heading. I'll coordinate with Sophia to ensure they're ready. As they completed the necessary preparations for the diversion, Sullivan reflected on the significance of what they were doing. This wasn't just about one disruptive passenger or one affected family. It was about establishing and enforcing boundaries of basic human dignity in a space where people of different backgrounds were temporarily bound together in the shared vulnerability of flight. The aircraft continued its turn, banking smoothly through the thin air 8 miles above the Atlantic. Below, the vast ocean stretched in endless blue-black, indifferent to the human drama unfolding above its surface. But in the contained world of Flight 247, a profound statement was being made about justice, consequences, and the true meaning of first class. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain James Sullivan. The captain's voice, steady, authoritative, with the subtle Pennsylvania inflection that emerged when he addressed passengers, filled the cabin. The usual background noise of conversation and entertainment systems faded as passengers registered the unusual timing of the announcement and the formal tone of Sullivan's address. I need your attention for an important update regarding our flight. In first class, the Williams family exchanged glances, tension visible in their postures despite their outward calm. Bradford straightened in his seat, a flash of triumph crossing his features, clearly assuming the announcement would favor his complaints. Due to a situation involving unacceptable passenger behavior that has escalated to threats against our crew, we are diverting to Halifax, Nova Scotia. The words landed like stones dropped in still water ripples of reaction spreading through the cabin. Bradford's expression transformed from smug anticipation to shock, his mouth opening slightly as the implications registered. We expect to land in approximately 75 minutes. Sullivan continued, his voice betraying none of the gravity of the decision he had made. Upon arrival in Halifax, security personnel will board the aircraft to remove the disruptive passenger. After refueling, we will continue our journey to London Heathrow. The silence that followed was electric. All eyes in first class turned toward Bradford, whose face had flushed a deep mottled red. The public identification was unmistakable, even without his name being specifically mentioned. I apologize for the inconvenience this will cause the majority of you who have conducted yourselves with courtesy and respect. American Airlines has zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior or threats to our crew members. The safety and dignity of all passengers and crew are our highest priorities. Sullivan's voice carried no anger, no emotion beyond professional resolve, which somehow made his words all the more powerful. Our flight attendants will provide more information as we approach Halifax. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation during this unexpected change to our journey. As the announcement concluded, the cabin erupted in a mixture of reactions. Most passengers in economy and business class, unaware of the specific incident, expressed confusion and frustration at the delay. In first class, however, the atmosphere was charged with understanding and judgment. Bradford stood abruptly, his movements jerky with rage, sweat visibly beading on his forehead despite the cabin's cool temperature. "This is outrageous," he shouted loud enough for his voice to carry throughout the first-class cabin. "You can't do this. I'm being singled out for expressing legitimate concerns about service standards." Sophia approached immediately, her expression professional but firm. "Mr. Bradford, you need to return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt. We're changing our flight path and the captain will be turning on the seatbelt sign momentarily. I demand to speak to the captain." Bradford's voice had risen to a near shout, a vein visibly pulsing at his temple. "This is discrimination against me. I have rights." From his seat, Raymond Ramirez spoke up, his judicial voice cutting through Bradford's ranting. "Young man, I suggest you comply with the flight attendant's instructions. Interfering with crew members during a flight change is a federal offense with serious consequences." Bradford's head swiveled toward Ramirez, momentarily derailed by this additional opposition. His designer glasses had slipped down his nose, requiring him to push them back up with a trembling finger. In his confusion, he failed to notice Alicia Dominguez discreetly recording his meltdown documentation that would later be viewed millions of times online. This is a conspiracy, Bradford sputtered, small droplets of saliva flying from his lips. You're all against me because I dared to speak up about declining standards. Dr. Marcus Williams remained seated, one arm protectively around Noah, his expression a careful mask of composure. He made brief eye contact with Sophia, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Recognition of the justice being enacted, appreciation for the crew's decisive stand. The seatbelt sign chimed on, adding official weight to Sophia's instructions. The familiar tone seemed louder than usual in the charged atmosphere, as if the aircraft itself were emphasizing the command. Mr. Bradford, this is your final warning. Sit down and fasten your seatbelt immediately, or I will need to report continued non-compliance to the captain. The explicit threat of further consequences finally penetrated Bradford's fury. With visible reluctance, he lowered himself into his seat, hands trembling slightly as he fastened his seatbelt. His muttering continued, but at a volume audible only to those immediately adjacent. Throughout the first-class cabin, passengers exchanged glances, some approving, others merely curious, none openly supportive of Bradford. The physical sensation of the aircraft banking into its turn back toward land seemed to underscore the dramatic reversal of fortune Bradford was experiencing. In row 2, Olivia leaned across the aisle toward Marcus. "Did they really just turn the plane around for him?" she whispered, disbelief mingling with vindication in her voice. Marcus nodded once, his expression solemn but his eyes reflecting a complex mixture of emotions. Satisfaction at seeing consequences, enforced sadness that his children were witnessing such ugliness, pride in the stand being taken by the crew. "Zoe," he said quietly to his daughter, "sometimes doing the right thing means changing direction." The 9-year-old nodded, her young face serious as she absorbed the situation unfolding before her, a lesson more valuable than anything in the London museums they would eventually visit. The massive aircraft continued its sweeping turn, the invisible hand of justice guiding its new trajectory. In the cockpit, Captain Sullivan maintained his focus on the technical aspects of the diversion, but part of him was acutely aware of the moral statement embodied in the simple act of turning the plane around. A declaration that some behaviors were so unacceptable that an entire aircraft with all its momentum and predetermined path would alter course to address them. "How long until we land?" Dad Noah Williams whispered the question, his small fingers nervously tracing the outline of his toy plane. The model's bright colors seemed at odds with the tense atmosphere that had settled over the first-class cabin like a heavy blanket. Dr. Marcus Williams checked his watch, the subdued cabin lighting reflecting off its sapphire crystal face. "About 30 minutes, buddy. Are you doing okay?" Noah nodded without conviction, his usual exuberance dampened by the tension that permeated the first-class cabin. Outside the window, darkness had swallowed the aircraft, the only visible features being the blinking navigation light on the wingtip and occasional glimpses of moonlight on cloud tops far below. The return journey to Halifax had transformed the aircraft from a vessel of excited anticipation to one of simmering discomfort. The cabin had developed strange acoustic properties, seemingly amplifying every cough, every rustle of fabric, every clink of ice in a glass, while conversations had dropped to barely audible murmurs. The Williams family had retreated into a protective bubble, parents focused on shielding their children from the continued hostility radiating from Seat 3C. Marcus maintained his composed exterior, though the subtle tightening around his eyes betrayed the emotional toll of the situation. Across the aisle, Olivia alternated between reading quietly with Zoe and exchanging supportive glances with her husband. The recycled cabin air seemed to have taken on a peculiar quality, thinner, somehow harder to breathe, despite the aircraft's sophisticated environmental control systems. The usual white noise of engines and air circulation that typically faded into the background now seemed more pronounced, filling the silence between sparse conversations. 3 rows behind them, Thomas Bradford had progressed through stages of rage to a cold, calculating fury. His initial outbursts had given way to intense phone activity, typing furious emails to airline executives, messaging business associates to mobilize support, and documenting his version of events in meticulous, self-justifying detail. Occasionally, he would mutter phrases just loud enough to be heard. Reverse discrimination woke airline policy's professional victims. Each comment was a deliberate barb thrown toward the Williams family, designed to wound, while maintaining plausible deniability if challenged directly. The overhead reading lights created isolated pools of illumination in the dimmed cabin, casting harsh shadows across Bradford's features as he hunched over his phone. The bluish glow from the screen gave his flushed face an almost ghostly appearance. Sophia and Miguel moved through the cabin with professional detachment, their service routine continuing despite the strained atmosphere. They paid particular attention to the Williams children, offering extra snacks and gentle reassurances. "Would you like another apple juice?" Noah Sophia asked, her smile genuine despite the circumstances. The boy nodded shyly. "Yes, please." As Sophia poured the juice, Bradford's voice cut through the cabin. "Funny how some passengers get special treatment while loyal customers get thrown off flights for speaking the truth." Sophia didn't acknowledge the comment directly, but the slight stiffening of her shoulders revealed its impact. She handed Noah his juice with a wink before moving on, her uniform rustling softly as she continued down the aisle. In row 1, Raymond and Elena Ramirez conversed quietly in Spanish, their expressions grave as they occasionally glanced back toward the Williams family and Bradford. Their decades of experience, Raymond as a judge, Elena as a social worker, had given them a profound understanding of the dynamics playing out in the confined space of the aircraft. "Este hombre es un monstruo de privilegio," Elena murmured, the soft consonants of her native language flowing melodically. "This man is a monster of privilege." Raymond nodded solemnly, the silver of his hair catching the light as he moved. "Y ahora enfrenta consecuencias reales por primera vez." And now he faces real consequences for the first time. Across the aisle in row 4, Alicia Dominguez was witnessing the professional and personal consequences of her social media post in real time. The video she had uploaded of Bradford's discriminatory comments had gone viral with astonishing speed, accumulating over 50,000 views in less than an hour. Her notifications were flooding with comments, shares, and messages from journalists seeking more information. The soft buzzing of her phone continued, despite having switched it to silent mode, the device vibrating against her thigh with increasing frequency as the story spread. One message in particular caught her attention, a direct inquiry from a reporter at the Washington Post asking for details about the incident and the captain's decision to divert. The story was escaping the confines of the aircraft, taking on a life of its own in the digital sphere. Alicia's company specialized in using AI to identify and address bias. Now she was witnessing in real time how digital platforms could amplify accountability for prejudice. The tension in the cabin was almost palpable, a high-pressure system of emotions contained within the pressurized metal tube. Relief came only from the cockpit, where Captain Sullivan's calm voice occasionally provided updates on their approach to Halifax. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sullivan. We're beginning our initial descent into Halifax Stanfield International Airport. Local weather is clear. Temperature is 62 degrees Fahrenheit. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. Bradford scoffed audibly at the announcement, his gold cufflinks catching the light as he gestured dismissively. "Enjoy your power trip while it lasts, Captain." He muttered, his use of air quotes around the title visible to those nearby. "We'll see who's still employed next week." From her seat, Zoe Williams watched Bradford with the unfiltered assessment of childhood. "Mom," she whispered, though not quietly enough, "why is that man so angry? We didn't do anything to him." The innocent question carried through the hushed cabin, highlighting the fundamental injustice of the situation with brutal clarity. Several passengers visibly winced at the reminder of what the Williams children were being subjected to. Olivia stroked her daughter's hair, the dark curls soft beneath her fingers. Some people carry anger inside them, sweetie. It spills out onto others who don't deserve it. It's not about us. It's about him. Bradford's face darkened further at overhearing this exchange, the color extending to the tips of his ears. Small beads of sweat had formed along his hairline despite the cabin's cool temperature. His fingers tightened around his phone until his knuckles whitened. "This is a setup," he hissed, to no one in particular, the words escaping through clenched teeth. "A complete setup to make me look like the villain." In reality, no setup had been necessary. Bradford had accomplished that entirely on his own. His prejudice exposed not by conspiracy, but by the simple presence of witnesses and recording devices in an enclosed space he couldn't control. As the aircraft began its descent toward Halifax, the passengers of Flight 247 found themselves on two distinct journeys, the physical return to land and the moral reckoning unfolding in their midst. For the Williams family, it was an unwanted detour on their vacation and a painful reminder of prejudices they could never entirely escape. For Bradford, it was the beginning of consequences that would extend far beyond this unexpected landing. The aircraft banked gently as it aligned with its approach path, the Nova Scotia coastline coming into view through the windows, a physical manifestation of the boundary being established between acceptable behavior and that which would no longer be tolerated. Halifax approach American 247 Heavy descending through 10,000 for 5,000, runway 25 in sight. Captain Sullivan's voice was steady and professional as he communicated with air traffic control, the practiced cadence of thousands of similar exchanges masking the exceptional circumstances of this particular arrival. Outside the cockpit windows, the lights of Halifax spread beneath them a constellation of human activity against the darkness of the Canadian night. In the first-class cabin, Sophia and Miguel moved efficiently through their arrival procedures, checking seatbelts and ensuring compliance with landing protocols. The professional rhythm of their actions created a veneer of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the underlying tension. "Electronic devices need to be stowed for landing, Mr. Bradford," Sophia said, pausing beside his seat. Bradford complied without comment, his earlier bravado having evaporated entirely, replaced by a rigid stillness that suggested barely contained fury. He stared straight ahead, refusing to make eye contact with crew members or fellow passengers, his jaw clenched tight enough to strain the muscles visibly. The cabin lighting had been adjusted for landing, the harsh brightness revealing details that had been softened by the dimmer cruising illumination. The tension lines around Bradford's eyes, the slight tremor in his hands, the sheen of perspiration on his forehead, despite the cabin's cool temperature. Through the window, Noah Williams spotted the flashing lights of emergency vehicles positioned near the runway standard procedure for an aircraft returning due to a security concern. The red and blue lights strobed against the darkness, creating rhythmic patterns against the night sky. "Dad, why are there so many police cars?" he asked, worry edging his voice as he pressed his small nose against the cool window. Marcus glanced out, then placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "They're just there as a precaution, buddy. Nothing to worry about." The scent of landing preparations filled the cabin, a mixture of cooling meal service equipment, the subtle antiseptic smell of the lavatories being secured, and the faint metallic tang of the hydraulic systems deploying the landing gear. Across the aisle, Olivia and Zoe were having a hushed conversation, Olivia clearly trying to frame the situation in terms her 9-year-old could process without being unnecessarily frightened. "The important thing to remember," Olivia said just loudly enough for Marcus to hear, "is that Captain Sullivan made a choice to stand up for what's right. That's something to be proud of even when it's difficult." The aircraft descended through 5,000 feet, the landing gear extending with a mechanical thunk that resonated through the cabin. The sound seemed to startle Bradford from his rigid posture. He looked around with newfound alertness, perhaps only now fully processing that the diversion and his impending removal were indeed happening. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice carrying in the quiet cabin. "They can't just throw me off a plane for expressing an opinion. I know my rights." From the row ahead, Raymond Ramirez turned slightly, the polished leather of his seat creaking softly with the movement. "What you expressed wasn't an opinion, sir. It was prejudice. And yes, they absolutely can remove you for it, particularly after you threatened a crew member." Bradford's face flushed anew, the color spreading unevenly across his features. "I did not threaten anyone. I merely pointed out potential consequences for unprofessional behavior." Sophia, who was checking seatbelts nearby, maintained her professional demeanor despite Bradford's revisionist account of their galley confrontation. Her silence spoke volumes, the disciplined refusal to engage with his provocations. The aircraft continued its descent, the gentle rumble of airflow against the fuselage providing a baseline soundtrack to the human drama within. Through the windows, the details of Halifax Stanfield International Airport became increasingly clear. The terminal buildings, the control tower, and the line of emergency vehicles positioned near the runway threshold. Among those vehicles was a nondescript black SUV that would carry the airport security officers tasked with removing Bradford from the flight. The legal machinery had been set in motion the moment Captain Sullivan declared a security issue procedures established post 9/11 that gave flight crews significant authority in determining who could remain aboard an aircraft. As the runway approached, Bradford's confidence in his position seemed to waver for the first time. The physical evidence of law enforcement waiting on the ground introduced a reality that his privilege and connections might not shield him from immediate consequences. His breathing quickened noticeably, his gaze darting between the approaching ground and the cabin door. The Williams family had settled into a quiet solidarity, parents positioned protectively on either side of their children. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, their dignity intact, despite Bradford's attempts to diminish them. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold, the slight decrease in engine noise signaling the final moments of flight. With practiced precision, Captain Sullivan guided the massive Boeing jet toward the center line, the main landing gear touching down with a puff of smoke and a firm chirp of rubber meeting asphalt. The reverse thrust engaged with a roar, pressing passengers gently forward in their seats as the aircraft decelerated. For most flights, this moment marked the relief of a safe arrival, the prelude to disembarking and continuing onward journeys. For Flight 247, it represented something more significant, the physical manifestation of a moral boundary, the enforcement of consequences for crossing lines of basic human decency. As the aircraft taxied toward its designated stand, Sophia made a final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at Halifax Stanfield International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the captain turns off the seatbelt sign. Security personnel will be boarding the aircraft momentarily. Your cooperation is appreciated during this process." The measured professionalism of her words contrasted with the extraordinary circumstances they described. This was no routine arrival announcement. It was the prelude to a public reckoning. The aircraft came to a complete stop. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated. And in the sudden silence following engine shutdown, the magnitude of what was about to happen settled over the first-class cabin like an invisible weight. Justice, so often delayed or denied in the face of privilege, was about to be served at an unexpected waypoint on the journey from New York to London. Welcome to Halifax Stanfield International Airport. Local time is 3:42 p.m. Sophia's announcement carried the practiced cadence of thousands of similar arrivals. The extraordinary circumstances of this particular landing cloaked in professional routine. Outside the windows, emergency vehicles had taken position near the aircraft's standard protocol for an unscheduled landing involving a security concern. The massive Boeing jet had touched down with Captain Sullivan's characteristic precision, the slight bump and squeal of tires meeting Canadian soil punctuating the tense atmosphere in the cabin. A faint scent of burning rubber drifted through the ventilation system, the inevitable byproduct of an enormous aircraft suddenly transitioning from flight to ground contact. As the aircraft taxied toward its designated stand, not at a regular gate, but at a remote position designed for security situations, The reality of what was happening seemed to finally penetrate Bradford's self-righteous bubble. "This is actually happening," he muttered, his voice barely audible above the whine of the slowing engines. His fingers gripped the armrest's knuckles, white with tension, the Italian leather of his shoes tapping an unconscious, anxious rhythm on the cabin floor. Across the aisle, Alicia Dominguez was documenting the arrival discreetly, her social media updates continuing to fuel the viral spread of the incident. Her latest post landed in Halifax. Security waiting to remove #first-class-racist from flight had generated thousands of reactions within minutes, the blue glow of her phone screen illuminating her determined expression. The Williams family maintained their dignity in silence. Marcus kept a protective arm around Noah, who pressed against his father's side, still clutching his toy airplane. The boy's earlier enthusiasm had been replaced by a solemn quietness that seemed at odds with his age. Olivia whispered reassurances to Zoe, who had abandoned her book about London, her attention now fully focused on the unfolding drama. Through the oval windows, the gray Halifax afternoon provided a stark backdrop for the scene, overcast skies and the distinctly northern quality of the light emphasizing the disruption to their intended journey. The cool air that seeped in around the aircraft door's seal carried the faint scent of sea and pine, so different from the recycled atmosphere of flight. As the aircraft came to a complete stop, Sophia made another announcement, her voice maintaining its professional composure, despite the extraordinary situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at our temporary stop in Halifax. We will be on the ground for approximately 1 hour for a security matter and refueling before continuing to London. During this time, we ask that all passengers remain seated. Security personnel will be boarding momentarily." The jet bridge didn't extend immediately, another sign of the non-standard nature of this arrival. Instead, a set of mobile stairs was positioned at the forward cabin door. Through the windows, passengers could see the small convoy of vehicles that had parked near the aircraft, 2 airport police cars, the black SUV carrying security personnel, and a representative from the airline's ground operations team. The overhead lights reflected off the rain-dampened tarmac, creating wavering patterns that seemed to mimic the tension inside the cabin. The temperature had dropped noticeably since the engines were powered down, the aircraft's environmental system struggling to maintain comfort without their heat generation. Bradford's earlier bravado had evaporated entirely, replaced by a nervous agitation that manifested in rapid breathing and darting glances. Small beads of sweat had formed along his hairline despite the cabin's cooling temperature. The man who had felt entitled to demand the removal of an entire family was now facing removal himself, and the irony was not lost on anyone in the first-class cabin. "You can't do this," he said to Sophia as she passed his seat, his voice lower but edged with desperation. "I'm meeting with Jackson Reynolds tomorrow morning. It's a $100 million acquisition deal. This is going to create an international incident." Sophia acknowledged him with professional detachment, her posture impeccable despite hours of service. "Security will be boarding shortly, Mr. Bradford. Please have your personal belongings ready." The forward cabin door opened with a distinctive pressurized hiss. Cool Canadian air rushed into the climate-controlled environment, carrying the faint scent of sea and earth so different from the recycled atmosphere of flight. 2 uniformed airport police officers entered first, their expressions neutral but alert as they surveyed the cabin. Behind them came Teresa Vasquez, American Airlines station manager for Halifax, a clipboard in her hand and a carefully composed expression on her face. Her heels clicked softly on the cabin floor as she approached the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "Good afternoon," Vasquez said to Sophia, her voice carrying the slight accent of her Cuban heritage. "Captain Sullivan has briefed us on the situation. We're ready to proceed." Sophia nodded, then turned to address the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the disruption to your journey. Security personnel will be escorting one passenger from the aircraft. Once this process is complete, we'll begin refueling for our continuation to London. Thank you for your patience and understanding." The Williams family watched in silence as the security team conferred briefly with Sophia, who indicated Bradford's seat with a discreet gesture. The officers nodded and began moving down the aisle, their purposeful stride conveying authority without aggression. Bradford sat rigid in his seat, his earlier entitlement calcifying into disbelief as the officers approached. Around him, the first-class cabin had gone completely still, passengers watching with the collective tension of witnesses to a moment of consequence. "Is this really necessary?" Bradford attempted as the officers reached his row, his voice straining for its former confidence, but achieving only a thin approximation. "This is a simple misunderstanding that's being blown completely out of proportion." The scent of his expensive cologne seemed suddenly cloying in the confined space, mixing unpleasantly with the stress-induced perspiration that had begun to seep through his tailored shirt. The officers remained professionally detached. "Sir," the taller officer said, "we need you to gather your belongings and come with us." Bradford looked around desperately seeking allies or escape routes and finding neither. His reflection in the window showed a man unraveling tie-askew, hair disheveled, face flushed with mortification. "This is outrageous," he protested, though with notably less volume than his earlier outbursts. "I'm being singled out for expressing legitimate concerns about service standards." From across the aisle, Marcus Williams finally broke his silence. "No, sir," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of truth. "You're being removed for demanding that my family be relegated to where we belong because of the color of our skin. There's a difference." The simple statement, delivered without anger or triumph, seemed to crystallize the moral clarity of the moment. Several passengers nodded in silent agreement. Even Bradford seemed momentarily stripped of his self-justifications, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. "Sir," the officer repeated more firmly, "please stand and collect your belongings now." The illusion of choice had evaporated. With visible reluctance, Bradford unbuckled his seatbelt and stood reaching for his briefcase in the overhead compartment with unsteady hands. The leather creaked as he lifted it down, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed cabin. His movements were stiff mechanical, as if his body were operating on automatic pilot, while his mind struggled to process the unprecedented challenge to his privilege. The fine wool of his suit earlier, a symbol of his status, now seemed to hang on him awkwardly, as if his physical diminishment had extended to his clothing. As he stepped into the aisle, Bradford cast one final glance at the Williams family, a look that contained a complex mixture of emotions, lingering, resentment, confusion, and perhaps buried beneath layers of entitlement, the first faint glimmer of recognition that he had catastrophically misjudged his position. The officers flanked him as he moved toward the exit, not touching him but positioned to intervene if necessary. The procession moved slowly up the aisle, Bradford's usual confident stride reduced to an awkward shuffle under the collective gaze of the first-class cabin. At the door, Teresa Vasquez waited with final documentation. "Mr. Bradford," she said formally, "you're being removed from American Airlines Flight 247 under the captain's authority for disruptive behavior and threatening a crew member. Your checked luggage will continue to London. You'll need to make separate arrangements for your return travel." She handed him a printed form which he accepted with unsteady fingers. "Additionally, pending further investigation, your American Airlines frequent flyer status has been suspended, and a security alert has been placed on your customer profile." This final blow, the revocation of the status he had wielded like a weapon, seemed to physically impact Bradford. He visibly flinched, as if the paper in his hand carried an electrical charge. "This isn't over," he managed, though the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You're right about that, sir," Vasquez replied with professional detachment. "The airline will be conducting a full investigation which may result in additional restrictions on your future travel." With no further recourse, Bradford finally stepped through the aircraft door onto the mobile stairs, where the officers waited to escort him to the waiting police vehicle. The metal steps rang hollowly beneath his Italian loafers as he descended into the gray Halifax afternoon, the chill Canadian air immediately penetrating his lightweight suit. His descent was watched by dozens of eyes from the aircraft windows, a visual metaphor for his fall from the privilege he had taken for granted. The police vehicle's door closed behind him with a definitive thunk, sealing him away from the community he had violated. As the aircraft door closed, a subtle release of tension swept through the first-class cabin. It wasn't celebration, the situation was too serious for that, but there was a palpable sense of justice served, of boundaries being enforced rather than words merely spoken. Sophia, who had maintained her professional demeanor throughout the removal, now approached the Williams family. Dr. and Mrs. Williams, she said, her voice warm with genuine concern. I want to personally apologize for what you and your children experienced today. It was unacceptable, and I'm sorry you had to endure it. Marcus nodded, his expression solemn but appreciative. Thank you, Sophia. And please, thank Captain Sullivan for us. His decision. It means more than he might realize. Outside, Bradford was being escorted to the police vehicle, his figure growing smaller with each step, not just physically distancing from the aircraft, but symbolically shrinking from the position of power he had assumed was his by right. Inside, the Williams family sat together in quiet solidarity, their dignity intact despite Bradford's attempts to diminish it. They had not asked for this conflict or this detour, but they had witnessed something rare and valuable, the system working as it should, protecting those it too often failed. Mr. Thomas Bradford. The taller officer's question hung in the pressurized air of the first-class cabin. Though clearly a formality rather than a genuine inquiry, the official verification of Bradford's identity seemed to crystallize the reality he had been desperately trying to deny. This was happening. It was happening to him specifically, and it was happening publicly. Bradford stood rigidly in the aisle, his Italian leather briefcase clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the lines of strain around his mouth and the beads of sweat at his temples. His cologne, an expensive, overpowering scent that had earlier seemed to announce his importance, now clung to him like a desperate reminder of status rapidly slipping away. "Yes," Bradford replied, his voice strained higher-pitched than his usual commanding tone. "But there's been a serious misunderstanding. I'm the victim here." The words echoed absurdly in the hushed cabin. From nearby seats, several passengers exchanged glances of disbelief at his continued self-deception. The second officer, a stockier man with close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair and the steady gaze of someone who had seen every variety of human misbehavior, maintained a neutral expression. "Sir, we need you to gather your belongings and come with us. This is not a negotiation." Teresa Vasquez, the American Airlines station manager, stood nearby with a tablet in hand. Her professional demeanor was impeccable, but the slight arch of her eyebrow conveyed volumes about her assessment of Bradford's claim to victimhood. The light glinted off her name badge as she shifted position, catching Bradford's eye. "Mr. Bradford," she said, "I have the incident report filed by the flight crew. You're being removed under the captain's authority for discriminatory behavior toward other passengers and making threats against a crew member. Both are violations of airline policy and federal aviation regulations." Bradford's gaze darted around the cabin, seeking allies or escape routes and finding neither. The other first-class passengers watched in silence, their expressions ranging from discomfort to unmistakable satisfaction at seeing consequences enforced. The Williams children, pressed against their parents' sides, observed with wide-eyed solemnity their first international trip, now including an unexpected lesson in accountability. "This is absurd," Bradford protested, though his voice had lost much of its earlier volume and confidence. "I merely expressed concerns about disruptive children." Any perceived offensive language was taken completely out of context. From seat 2C, Dr. Marcus Williams finally spoke up, his voice calm but carrying undeniable moral authority. You told my family to move to where we belong. You said we had no business being in first class. There is no context that makes those statements anything other than what they are. The cabin air seemed to vibrate with the truth of these simple words. Several passengers nodded in agreement, including Raymond Ramirez, whose judicial bearing lent additional weight to the collective judgment. Elena Ramirez's silver crucifix caught the light as she nodded beside her husband, her expression a mixture of sadness and resolution. Bradford's face flushed anew, caught between denial and the undeniable reality of multiple witnesses. His expensive glasses had slipped slightly down his nose, requiring an adjustment that seemed suddenly awkward and undignified. You're twisting my words. I never intended. Sir, the first officer cut in firmly, his tone brooking no further argument. We're not here to adjudicate what was said. The captain has exercised his authority to have you removed from this flight. You can either walk off voluntarily, or we can use necessary force. The choice is yours, but you are leaving this aircraft. The explicit threat of physical enforcement seemed to finally penetrate Bradford's bubble of entitlement. His shoulders sagged slightly as the last vestiges of his resistance crumbled the fabric of his tailored suit, suddenly appearing to hang loosely on his frame as if he had physically diminished. Fine, he muttered, but this is completely unjustified. I'll be contacting my attorney the moment we're on the ground. The irony of his statement, they were already very much on the ground, his circumstances already drastically altered, was lost on no one. Teresa Vasquez made a note on her tablet, the subtle tap of her stylus punctuating Bradford's empty threat. That's your right, Mr. Bradford. Now please proceed to the exit. As Bradford turned to move toward the door, Captain James Sullivan emerged from the cockpit. His timing was deliberate, allowing the security officers to handle the initial confrontation while reserving his authority for this crucial moment. He stood in the galley area, his uniform crisp, his posture straight but not rigid, his expression neither triumphant nor apologetic. The cabin lights reflected off the 4 gold stripes on his epaulets as he surveyed the scene with calm authority. Bradford froze momentarily at the sight of the captain, a renewed flush of anger coloring his features. You, he said, a tremor of indignation returning to his voice. You're making a career-ending mistake. I have connections on the board. One call from me. Sullivan raised a hand, cutting off the threat with a simple gesture. Mr. Bradford. He said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had made difficult decisions in far more demanding circumstances on my aircraft. Every passenger is entitled to dignity and respect regardless of their race, religion, gender, or any other characteristic. Every crew member deserves to work without intimidation or threats. Sullivan paused, his gaze steady on Bradford's increasingly flustered face. Your behavior violated both these principles. The decision to divert wasn't personal. It was about maintaining the boundaries of decent conduct. Bradford attempted to interrupt, but Sullivan continued, his voice gaining strength without increasing in volume. In this cabin, everyone flies first class or no one does. That's not about the price of a ticket. It's about how we treat each other. The simple statement, powerful in its clarity and moral certainty, seemed to echo through the cabin. Several passengers nodded in silent agreement. Even Bradford appeared momentarily speechless, his usual arsenal of self-justifications inadequate against such fundamental truth. Now, Sullivan concluded, I have 210 other passengers who deserve to reach their destination with minimal delay. Officers, please escort Mr. Bradford from my aircraft. The security officers moved forward with renewed purpose. Sir, the taller one said to Bradford, this way, please. Bradford's walk of shame down the aisle was conducted in silence, broken only by the soft thud of his footsteps on the carpet and the creak of leather as passengers shifted to watch his departure. The man who had entered the aircraft with the swagger of entitlement now moved with the stiff mechanical steps of someone sleepwalking through a nightmare. As he passed the Williams family's row, he kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, unable or unwilling to face those he had attempted to humiliate. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air after he passed a fading reminder of his presence. At the aircraft door, Teresa Vasquez waited with final documentation. "Mr. Bradford, this notice confirms you were removed from American Airlines Flight 247 under the captain's authority. Your checked baggage will continue to London. You'll need to make separate arrangements for your return travel." She handed him a printed form, which he accepted with unsteady fingers. "Additionally, pending further investigation, your American Airlines frequent flyer status has been suspended, and a security alert has been placed on your customer profile." This final blow, the revocation of the status he had wielded like a weapon, seemed to physically impact Bradford. He visibly flinched, as if the paper in his hand carried an electrical charge. His platinum frequent flyer card, which had served as a tangible symbol of his perceived superiority, was now just a piece of plastic with no power. "This isn't over," he managed, though the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears, his voice lacking the resonance it had possessed just hours earlier. "You're right about that," Sir Vasquez replied with professional detachment. "The airline will be conducting a full investigation which may result in additional restrictions on your future travel." With no further recourse, Bradford finally stepped through the aircraft door onto the mobile stairs where the officers waited to escort him to the waiting police vehicle. The metal steps rang hollowly beneath his Italian loafers as he descended into the gray Halifax afternoon, the chill Canadian air immediately penetrating his lightweight suit and raising goosebumps on his flesh. His descent was watched by dozens of eyes from the aircraft windows, a visual metaphor for his fall from the privilege he had taken for granted. The police vehicle's door closed behind him with a definitive thunk, sealing him away from the community he had violated. As the aircraft door closed behind Bradford with a pressurized hiss, a subtle release of tension swept through the first-class cabin. It wasn't celebration, the situation was too serious. The Williams family too genuinely hurt for that, but there was a palpable sense of justice served, of boundaries being enforced, rather than words merely spoken. Sophia, who had maintained her professional demeanor throughout the removal, now approached the Williams family. "Dr. and Mrs. Williams," she said, her voice warm with genuine concern. "I want to personally apologize for what you and your children experienced today. It was unacceptable, and I'm sorry you had to endure it." Marcus nodded, his expression solemn but appreciative. "Thank you, Sophia. And please thank Captain Sullivan for us. His decision, it means more than he might realize." Outside, Bradford was being escorted to the police vehicle, his figure growing smaller with each step, not just physically distancing from the aircraft, but symbolically shrinking from the position of power he had assumed was his by right. Inside, the Williams family sat together in quiet solidarity, their dignity intact, despite Bradford's attempts to diminish it. They had not asked for this conflict or this detour, but they had witnessed something rare and valuable, the system working as it should, protecting those it too often failed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sullivan. The security matter has been resolved, and we're now preparing for our continuation to London Heathrow." The captain's voice, coming through the cabin speakers, carried a subtle but noticeable shift in tone, the tension of the preceding hour giving way to a more relaxed cadence. Outside, ground crew members moved efficiently around the aircraft, completing the refueling process under the gray Halifax sky. "Our ground team is completing refueling, and we expect to be underway in approximately 30 minutes. I apologize again for the unexpected delay, and thank you for your patience and understanding during this situation." As the announcement concluded, a subtle but palpable shift in the cabin's atmosphere became evident. With Bradford's removal, the toxic presence that had poisoned the environment had been extracted, allowing passengers to collectively exhale a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The air itself seemed lighter, somehow easier to breathe, as if the cabin's environmental system had suddenly improved its efficiency. The soft ambient lighting that had earlier seemed harsh now created a warm, almost protective glow throughout the premium space. Sophia moved through the first-class cabin with renewed warmth, checking on passengers and answering questions about the revised arrival time in London. The gentle rustle of her uniform and the subtle scent of her perfume created a sensory reminder of normalcy returning. When she reached the Williams family, she paused longer than professional necessity required. "How are you all doing?" she asked, her question directed primarily at Zoe and Noah. She crouched slightly to meet them at eye level, her expression conveying genuine concern rather than practiced courtesy. Noah looked up from his toy airplane, which he had been clutching tightly throughout the ordeal. His expression was cautious but brightening like sunshine gradually emerging from behind clouds. "Are we going to London now?" Sophia smiled, the warmth reaching her eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. "Yes, we are. And you know what? We have special ice cream sundaes for brave passengers. Would you like one?" Noah's eyes widened, a flash of childlike excitement breaking through the solemnity that had settled over him. "Yes, please." Across the aisle, Captain Sullivan had emerged from the cockpit during the ground stop, a rare appearance in the cabin that signified the exceptional nature of what had transpired. He moved with quiet purpose toward the Williams family, his uniform crisp despite the long flight and unexpected diversion. The overhead lights caught the silver in his hair as he approached, lending him an almost patrician appearance. "Dr. and Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice pitched for privacy despite the attentive audience of nearby passengers. "On behalf of the entire crew and American Airlines, I want to express our sincere regret for what you and your children experienced today." Marcus stood to shake Sullivan's hand, a gesture of respect between professionals accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. Their hands met firmly, the contact brief but meaningful. Captain Sullivan Marcus said, his voice carrying the particular warmth reserved for expressions of genuine gratitude. "Your actions today spoke louder than any apology could. Thank you for showing my children that sometimes justice isn't just an abstract concept." Sullivan nodded, understanding the deeper significance behind the words. The lines around his eyes deepened slightly as he replied, "It was the only right decision, Dr. Williams. No family should ever be made to feel unwelcome because of who they are." From Seat 1A, Raymond Ramirez cleared his throat. "Captain," he said, his judicial voice carrying quiet authority in my years on the bench, "I saw countless instances where people in authority chose the easy path over the right one. What you did today, turning an entire aircraft around to stand for basic human dignity, that's leadership of the highest order." Elena Ramirez nodded in agreement, her silver hair catching the light as she moved. "It gives me hope," she added softly, her accent more pronounced with emotion. "In these times, we need such examples." Sullivan accepted their comments with modest grace, clearly uncomfortable with praise for what he considered simply doing his job correctly. His hands rested easily at his sides, his posture relaxed but still conveying natural authority. "We still have a flight to complete," he said deftly, redirecting attention to the practical matters at hand. "We should be departing shortly. The weather looks clear all the way to London now." As Sullivan returned to the cockpit, Sophia began preparing the cabin for departure. The interruption had added nearly 2 hours to their journey, but the mood among passengers had transformed remarkably. The tension that had permeated the space had been replaced by something approaching solidarity, a shared experience of witnessing consequences enforced and dignity defended. Alicia Dominguez was experiencing the aftermath in a different dimension. Her social media posts documenting Bradford's behavior and subsequent removal had exploded online. Her phone continued to vibrate with notifications as the video spread across platforms, accumulating hundreds of thousands of views and generating passionate discussion about privilege, accountability, and justice in commercial aviation. "I can't believe it," she murmured to herself, scrolling through the responses. "This has gone completely viral." A message notification appeared from a senior producer at CNN requesting an interview. Similar requests from other major news outlets filled her inbox. The incident on Flight 247 had transcended a private conflict to become a public conversation about where society draws its lines. Meanwhile, Zoe Williams had overcome her earlier distress and was engaged in animated conversation with Elena Ramirez, who was sharing stories about growing up in Colombia and moving to America as a young woman. The gentle intergenerational exchange represented exactly the kind of human connection that air travel at its best could facilitate, the opposite of the division Bradford had attempted to enforce. Noah, emboldened by Bradford's absence, had resumed making his toy airplane perform aerial maneuvers above his tray table. The plastic wings caught the light as they dipped and soared, his childish joy temporarily suppressed by an adult's prejudice reasserting itself with the resilience unique to children. Olivia leaned across the aisle toward Marcus. "This isn't how I imagined starting our vacation," she said with a rueful smile, reaching to adjust his slightly askew tie in a gesture of affectionate normalcy. Marcus took her hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm, a private gesture of affection and solidarity they had shared throughout their 15 years together. "Maybe not," he replied, "but I think the kids just learned something valuable." As the engines began their startup sequence, the vibration running through the aircraft signaling their imminent departure, the Williams family settled back into the comfortable first-class seats they had rightfully purchased, seats that represented not just premium service, but the fruits of their hard work, determination, and excellence. The massive aircraft began to taxi its wheels, turning once more toward London. They had been delayed, but not deterred. Bradford's attempt to diminish their belonging had failed completely, and in its failure, a powerful truth had been affirmed. Dignity was not a luxury to be rationed based on prejudice. It was a right that required defending, even if that meant turning an entire plane around to do so. The story of Flight 247 reminds us that sometimes justice doesn't require grand gestures or elaborate systems. Sometimes it simply needs one person with authority to say, "This stops here." Captain James Sullivan's decision to divert an international flight represented more than an operational choice. It was a moral stand that transformed what could have been another dispiriting incident of consequence-free prejudice into a powerful demonstration of accountability. With a single command to turn the aircraft around, he established that dignity wasn't negotiable regardless of status or privilege. What makes this story so compelling isn't just Bradford's shocking behavior or his subsequent downfall, it's the ripple effects that followed. A single moment of decisive leadership catalyzed concrete changes across multiple organizations. American Airlines implemented the Sullivan Protocol. Other carriers adopted similar frameworks. Bradford Heritage Properties underwent fundamental restructuring, and Reynolds Innovation Group formed a partnership with Dr. Williams Foundation that will potentially benefit thousands of children worldwide. These tangible outcomes remind us that accountability isn't just about punishment, it's about creating space for something better. When Bradford was removed from that flight, he wasn't the only thing ejected from the aircraft. His prejudice, entitlement, and the tacit permission for such behavior were also shown the door, allowing something more positive to take their place. Perhaps most significantly, the incident provided the Williams children with a powerful life lesson. Instead of learning that prejudice goes unchallenged and unaddressed, they witnessed justice in action, a lesson far more valuable than any tourist attraction London could offer. They saw that standing firm in one's dignity, even when under attack, creates the possibility for meaningful resolution rather than mere endurance. In a world where consequences often seem reserved for those with the least power, Bradford's experience offered a counterexample that resonated deeply across diverse communities. His fall from privilege, triggered entirely by his own actions and choices, demonstrated that accountability can indeed reach those who have long considered themselves exempt from it. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished someone in authority would step up? Have you been in Captain Sullivan's position, faced with the choice between comfortable silence and difficult action? Or perhaps you've experienced what the Williams family endured, being treated as if you don't belong in spaces you've rightfully earned. These moments of injustice occur daily across our society. In workplaces, schools, public transportation, retail establishments, anywhere humans interact within power structures. Most pass without resolution, leaving both victims and witnesses with the dispiriting sense that nothing will change because nothing ever does. But Flight 247 offers us a different vision, one where speaking up matters, where documentation creates accountability, where authority can be used to protect rather than oppress. It reminds us that while we cannot control others' prejudices, we can control our response to them both individually and collectively. Think about your own sphere of influence. You might not command an aircraft, but you likely have some context where your voice carries weight. It might be as a parent-teacher, supervisor, team leader, or simply as a bystander whose perspective others respect. In those moments when you witness someone being diminished, excluded, or disrespected based on who they are, rather than what they've done, what will you do? Will you be Sophia, documenting the situation and elevating it to those with decision-making authority? Will you be Alicia Dominguez, creating a record that prevents gaslighting and denial? Will you be Raymond Ramirez, lending your respected voice to affirm what's right? Or might you even be Captain Sullivan, using your authority to ensure consequences for behavior that violates basic human dignity? The power to change harmful patterns doesn't always require special authority or position. Sometimes it simply requires the courage to say, "This is wrong," and the persistence to ensure that statement is heard. If this story of justice at 30,000 feet resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful, true stories. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Perhaps someone facing discrimination who needs reassurance that accountability is possible, or someone in a position of authority who needs inspiration to use their power constructively. Have you ever witnessed someone standing up against discrimination in a powerful way? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might provide exactly the inspiration someone else needs to find their voice in a difficult moment. Remember to turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon so you never miss our new uploads. We're dedicated to sharing these powerful narratives of everyday heroes who prove that even in challenging circumstances, one person's principled stand can create ripples of positive change that extend far beyond a single moment or decision. This is Bliss Whispers, reminding you that in the journey toward justice, sometimes the most important decision is simply to turn the plane around.